Hi everyone, thank you for joining me today for the new episode of the podcast A Journey into Fraud Prevention. I'm your host Ivan Prokofiev. Here's the deal, I have a favor to ask you. If you're ever enjoying the context of this podcast or you're enjoying this episode right now, please hit the subscribe button. It helps the podcast a lot. Additionally, it allows me to invite more and more new guests. I will do everything to improve the podcast and increase the quality of the podcast as well. Thank you. And поехали. Hi Jim, how are you today?
I'm doing well, Ivan. Thank you.
Thank you for finding time to join me today. Could I ask you please to introduce yourself for people who don't know you?
Sure. My name is Jim Vogt. I am a certified fraud examiner. I wear a number of hats. I'm CEO and founder of the Fraud Protection Institute through which we provide training and consulting to businesses and their management, their boards, their employees around fraud awareness, fraud risk assessment, detection, prevention, those types of things. And I'm also a professor at San Diego State University where I teach fraud examination and forensic accounting.
Thank you for the great introduction. We're going to speak about a lot of the things during this podcast. I actually want to start with the simple questions. Fraud prevention. What is fraud prevention for you?
You know, fraud prevention for me, there's so many things, but I think for me, the most important aspect of fraud prevention is awareness and training. We can't stop what we aren't aware of or that we don't understand. And I think that this is where we often fall short, whether it's individually by people not knowing enough about phishing emails, about, some of the risk to being online, some of the risk to social media, those types of things. If people aren't aware of them, they can't avoid them. For organizations, again, a lack of awareness, a lack of understanding and training, particularly in the employees who are in the best position to see things that aren't going right or that don't look right, but we don't train them enough. So I think the biggest part of fraud prevention is about awareness and training.
So if we're looking from this perspective, from this prism that you describe, so it doesn't matter how is a good system in place. If you don't know what you're fighting and what you want to prevent, it doesn't matter if you have everything, all possible solution in place.
Yeah, I think you make a good point there. A lot of times an organization will have good systems in place or think they do, have internal controls in place. But if people don't understand them and don't understand why they're there, they have a tendency to think, oh, well, I can be more efficient by skipping this step. And what they don't know is they're circumventing an internal control that puts the organization at risk.
Great. And how long have you been in the fraud prevention industry?
Well, officially, I have been a certified fraud examiner since 2008. So I guess that's coming up on 16 years. I think unofficially I was part of it before then. At the time, I worked in financial institutions, primarily in payment systems, and designed payment systems like check processing systems, credit card, lockbox, electronic payments, those types of things. And you can't do a really good job in payments if you don't understand fraud and the things that can go wrong. So I was involved even back then, but officially I've been a CFE since 2008.
If we're speaking about changes in the fraud prevention for all this period of time, what changed so far and where it's going when we speak about fraud prevention?
It's interesting. It's a little bit of a paradox because in some ways things are changing dramatically. And in other ways, nothing's changing. If we look at the type of fraud that's going on, what we often find it's the same schemes that have been going on for decades and decades. Ponzi schemes still work. There might be some minor adaptations or changes to those, but they still work. It's still the same type of schemes, sometimes slightly revised. But then again, at the same time, things have changed dramatically. When we consider things like digitalization, I was mentioning check processing and checks earlier. The whole nature of check fraud has changed with electronic checks and electronic check clearing. But again, much of it's still the same. We have things like AI that are coming in and influencing the fraud landscape without a doubt, and making many types of frauds easier for the perpetrators, improving their efforts. Phishing emails that where they're using AI can be improved. We used to be able to count on the fact that there was misspellings and poor grammar and those types of things. So they're getting better at those things. And then we have things like deep fakes, deep fake audio and deep fake video that are improving some of the efforts of the fraudsters. So we have technology in that way. But on the other side, we have the ability to leverage AI and some of these technologies in fighting against the fraudsters as well. So, like I said, in some ways, things don't change. The schemes still are very much the same, but in other ways, they're enabled by technology, and we have to make sure we keep up with those things.
So, as a conclusion, we can say that actually we changing in line how the fraud change. So it's become more digital. That's mean we start to working with a lot of digital things. When we start to using AI, we also start to looking on this perspective how we can prevent AI. Yeah, that's a game of Tom and Jerry. We try to catch Jerry, and it's always going somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. It's one of those things where no matter what we do, we're always going to be behind. It's just a matter of making sure that we don't fall further behind by trying to anticipate, constantly studying what fraudsters are doing, how they're doing it, how they're leveraging these technologies, and at the same time studying and analyzing how we can leverage them ourselves.
When they speaking about your particular journey, I have two types of questions. So first one, why in the first place you decide to join the fraud fighting industry? And then my second question is why you join the place to start to help people to get certification for fraud prevention.
Well, I think, I mentioned earlier that further back in my career, I was in payment systems. And not only did I work in those payment systems, but I was developing those for institutions that didn't have check processing or didn't have those types of things at the time. And when you're building something from the ground up, you have to be very well aware of not only how things should be done, but what can go wrong. I always called it the dark side of payment systems. And so I think out of necessity and also out of interest, I became very interested in what could go wrong. I became very interested in fraud in payments and educated myself and got involved in that. And then decided to formalize that by, I ended up going and getting my master's degree in economic crime management and then getting my CFE certification to kind of become official in the space. And then for me, I think partially because of the fact that I was very well into my career, it was a little tough to go back and start over. And plus, I think I have always had a natural interest in teaching and educating. So I decided to take my knowledge, my certification, and leverage that primarily in educating others, training others how to protect themselves, and at the university level, hoping to influence some of the graduating college students to see the career possibilities and perhaps to have a hand in hopefully beginning the education of future fraud fighters.
So my assumption is that what's motivate you to stay in the industry for a long time. The first one, as a professor, you actually motivate people to join this fraud fighting and share your knowledge. It's the first type of motivation. But another one, if we're speaking in general, why you stay longer in the fraud fighting area, because the work you're doing, it means something, and you help companies and people to protect themselves, and via education or via help them to establish system and build something that's going to use by consumers but not by fraudsters.
Absolutely. I mean, the more we learn about it, the more we understand the vulnerabilities. We understand how individuals are vulnerable. We understand how organizations are vulnerable. I see every day how organizations underestimate the threat that they have within their own organization of their own employees committing fraud against them. And so when I see that, not only that vulnerability, but oftentimes, I don't want to say ignorance, but a little bit of naivete that then, organizations oftentimes understand that fraud is happening out there, but they have this belief that it won't happen in their organization. So when you see this vulnerability and you see these types of beliefs, yeah, I mean, we all know that fraud's not going away ever. Then it's a matter of, well, how can I make a difference? How can I, protect? How can I help educate and protect these individuals and make them more aware?
And speaking about your experience as a professor in the university, can you share with us a bit like about that kind of experience? So I understand the motivation behind it, why you're starting this one. Actually, it's better to ask started from another questions. What is ASFE and why it is exist? Why it is important, and should everyone actually try to get this certificate who work in the fraud industry?
Well, ACFE is the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, and they are probably the preeminent, probably the largest certification body in the fraud fighting industry. There are certainly others, but they've been around for a while. I don't even know what their numbers are, but I think some of the last ones out, they have something like 80,000 certified fraud examiners around the world. It's very international in scope. And certainly it's been demonstrated, number one, that being a part of the organization provides credibility, provides, because of the education and learning that it takes in order to get the certification and to maintain it, the networking and the type of resources that are available to us as CFEs just help us to continue to get better, to continue to keep up with those things. And it's been shown that being certified, whether it's CFE or some other certifications, but especially the CFE, it's been shown that oftentimes it can make a difference in an individual maybe getting a particular position, a new job. And sometimes it makes a difference in even the pay level, the difference between having a certification or not. But being a part of that organization and meeting and networking other like-minded professionals has certainly been a very big positive for me. And I would certainly recommend that anyone that is interested in, it's in being in fraud fighting, and continuing to be, that they look at the CFE or other certifications, because it certainly adds credibility, gives them access to a network and resources that it's difficult to find otherwise.
So when I did my research and looking on SafeE certificate, I saw it's like if you look into position in fin crime in like one of the banks, it's very often required this one, or at least a lot of the banks say it's preferable to have. However,
Mm-hmm.
I didn't see much requirement from the merchant perspective. Do you think the merchant also need to start the requirement, this certification to maybe hire specialists with this kind of knowledge, or it's still primarily focusing on the bank industry, like investments as well?
Well, it's certainly prevalent in the banking industry, but one of the things that I always found interesting about the ACFE is when I go to one of their events, whether it's a local event or a national event, I'm always amazed by the variety of the individuals that you'll run into. You'll find people from the banking industry, the insurance industry, law enforcement, government agencies, private investigators, and many others, that they're all certified fraud examiners, but they're all applying it in a very different way. And that's one of the things that I find interesting. So I think that Certainly the credit card industry probably leverages CFEs a lot. Certainly the banking industry, as I mentioned, the insurance industry, law enforcement, government agencies like the FBI, IRS, criminal investigations, and on and on. So there's a great variety of how the certification is leveraged and applied. And I always find that that's one of the most interesting things about it is that we all have this in common, but we all have very different backgrounds and very different ways in which we leverage and apply what we learn and what we know about being a certified fraud examiner.
What you would recommend to people who considering to getting this certificate? Is it required any particular, I don't know, prior knowledge in the industry, or it's actually something that you can learn even if you never work in fraud prevention and you decide to join this industry, like somewhere from, I don't know, accounting or from customer service?
Mm-hmm. Well, to earn the CFE certification, there's an exam, that a 4-part exam that has to be passed, but there's also an experience requirement. So it's not that it's certainly something that can be learned by someone that it's new to, but there's a certain amount of leverage or a certain amount of experience that they would need in some sort of fraud fighting role in order to be able to attain the actual certification.
Got you. Thank you for that additional information. And you mentioned like huge networking, like 18,000 or even more right now. But when you do lectures as a professor for people who try to get this certification, do you think it's also going to be help if we're going to have the same kind of like awareness lecture for new generations and not related to fraud? In general, everyone who going to universities, they might have a couple of lections about fraud prevention in general. Do you think it's going to be very helpful to in the general world for controllables?
You know, I think you make a very good point there, and that's a great question because, for example, right now I have about 50 students in my fraud examination class. And at the university, this class is an elective. So typically they're seniors that are within a semester or two of graduating. They're all accounting majors, or the majority of them are accounting majors, maybe a few MBAs. And I'll be surprised if more than one or two actually ends up being involved in a career related to fraud. And my point to them and to anyone is that the type of education, just basic education about financial crime and the risk that it represents to an organization, it's my personal belief that any business related graduate, whether it's a business administration, a finance, accounting, I truly believe that any of them should have at least one course in financial crimes or fraud examination to truly understand the risk that's involved, to understand the risk that's out there to both from inside and outside the organization, and to have at least an understanding of what can be done and what needs to be done to prevent and detect fraud. Because it's a universal problem. No one is immune to it. So I think that this type of education, at least at a basic level, should not be limited to just those that are looking to get into the fraud fighting industry. I think we all need a basic understanding. So when I have students in my class, even if they're going in to be to be auditors or tax accountants or to be, a controller in a corporation, any of those individuals in my mind, need this level of understanding about fraud risk. I think this type of education is valuable to anyone that's going to be involved in business. And I also think that there's a certain level of education that's valuable to us as individuals, because we're all going to get, phishing emails. We're all going to, be subjected to attempts to defraud us individually. And again, the more we understand that, the better we're going to be able to protect ourselves.
Yeah, this actually aligns with my thoughts as well, because I believe as the earlier we start to share this one, maybe even like, I'm not sure about school, maybe from the early um, university, probably not like everyone going to be happy or just catch a lot, but some like knowledge going to be somewhere behind there in their mind to say, when they see something suspicious, they realize, okay, about it in university. It's better just like to wait for a second, or maybe follow up to ask, maybe do a small investigation before I proceed with any action that some person requests from me.
Right. Exactly.
And speaking about victims of fraud, have you been victim of fraud?
I have not. I've been fortunate. I came close once a couple years ago where someone spoofed an email from another of the board members from the local chapter of the ACFE, and said they were traveling and asked me to go out and get some gift cards for a donation. And I knew that this person was actually traveling. So, there was a moment where I thought, oh, I need to do this. And then I realized, oh, wait a minute. So that's one where awareness certainly helped me. So there, I've come close, but I've been fortunate so far.
This is a great example of cases when you, like, as you mentioned, this, you're aware about the problem, you just like wait for a second and realize, okay, before I proceed with the future, it's probably some requirement needs. Yeah. And in a new era of AI, we see it happens everywhere, like the huge announcement in the newspapers that someone like send over like billions because they got confirmation from CFO. It's really frustrating, and I believe we'll see more and more cases like that.
Oh, without a doubt.
And then from a career perspective and fraud prevention, you did a significant career in fraud prevention, but can you give a bit of advice for people who are like starting this career right now and just like they really don't know if they suit for this field, and if they suit, how is they going to be growing in this career? Any types of advices for that?
I think to be successful in this type of career, there's a couple of character or personality traits that are really important. Persistence is one of them. Inquisitiveness and curiosity, I think, is another. I think that one of the things that I tell my students, that if I don't teach them anything else, I like them to leave my course with a better idea of what I call the investigative mindset. And that is, too often employees in an organization see things that don't look right, see things that are suspicious, but they shrug them off. They just assume, well, I just assume that the supervisor knew about it, or I just assume everything was okay. And they let it go. Well, someone that's going to be successful in the fraud fighting industry can't do that. They have to be persistent. If something doesn't look right, they have to become a bulldog, I like to call it. They have to become a bulldog and grab hold of it and say, I'm not going to let go until I have an answer that yes, this is legitimate, or no, it's not. And I think that in order to do that, we've got to have that persistence. We can't shrug things off. And so I think it becomes a mindset, and for someone to be successful in this industry, I think that type of persistence, that type of inquisitiveness to continue asking questions is essential to being successful in this industry.
People who, I don't know, as you mentioned, let it go for that case, does it mean that they are not actually? Yeah, it's probably another reason behind it, because maybe some people are not happy where they're sitting right now and in a position where they are because of the multiple reasons. But the main advice, what I understand so far, that if you, before the process, you even think for a second, it's something you can grow inside you, and then when the next case happens, you just maybe have like better like knowledge how to process with this one, or at least like doing something before you actually click on the button, for example.
Well, exactly. I think that human beings have a tendency to rationalize, to explain things that don't make sense to them. And we fill in the blanks in our mind and we rationalize or justify. And that's the type of thing that a successful fraud examiner can't do. We can't make those assumptions. We can't make those rationalizations. We have to, being a fraud examiner or just being in this industry is all about finding the truth. It's all about finding about, well, what's really happening here. And, there's a reason that auditors are required to exercise professional skepticism. It's for that exact reason. If something doesn't look right, you can't just justify and assume that everything's okay. We need to be skeptical about it and find the answer rather than just assume that everything's okay.
Thank you for additional description. It's really, really great how you put it in that place. And I probably have one last question. Do you have any fraud nightmare case that you cannot shake from your memory? Something that happens during all your career and it still constantly like remind you, I know, every day, every month, every year.
One thing about being in this industry and just having an awareness is that there's an endless number of cases. Every day, we will see stories of embezzlement, of romance fraud, of business email compromise, on and on and on. And so we're bombarded with these things. And because I am more on the prevention and detection side and not so much on the investigation side, I don't get deeply involved in these cases. But every once in a while, I read of a case that just sticks in my mind. And there's one that I read of at the end of the year that's continued to stick in my mind just because of the impact that oftentimes we underestimate that these frauds have. This was a newspaper in Oregon that had been in operation for, I think, like 40 years. And they distributed a free newspaper. I think they printed something like 30,000 issues in addition to providing it online. And they had to close down right before Christmas at the end of last year because of an internal embezzlement. Someone for a number of years had been paying themselves over $100,000, found that the organization had over $100,000 in unpaid bills, including to the paper's printer. Money that was supposed to be going into retirement accounts from employee paychecks was diverted and was never deposited into their savings into their retirement accounts. And all these people had to be laid off, and the newspaper had to shut down and quit printing. And you look at the impact of this, and this was a relatively small operation. I think there were 10 employees. But they all lost their jobs. They all lost their livelihood right before Christmas. And we hear these things every day. And sometimes we underestimate. We think, well, these businesses, yeah, they're going to lose money. It's just a cost of doing business. But we don't understand oftentimes the impact on human lives. You can go back a few decades to the frauds that happened in the late 90s and the early 2000s, the Enrons, the MCI WorldCom and those ones where investors lost tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars. People lost their life savings and their retirements. I think we often underestimate the impact that fraud has. And it's cases like this where you read that, people lose their livelihood and it affects their lives, not only today, but for the future. Those things stick with me. They haunt me. And it's part of what keeps me going.
Yeah, it's most of the stories, they are really heartbreaking, specific events happens before holidays, and you realize that it's not only ruin like a lot of things for the people, it even ruin holidays when it's supposed to be like family time, but most of them right now start to thinking about different stuff which they're not expecting to think about.
Right.
Yeah. To be honest, I don't have any other questions. However, if you want to share any project you might working on or anything that you want to influence people to focus about, this is a great time.
You know, I think just generally, I would say take advantage of every opportunity to educate yourself, whether it's individually or professionally. Awareness is the best thing that's going to protect us. Certainly, if I can ever help with training in an organization, I'm happy to do that. I do have an event coming up in about a month, the Fraud Leadership Summit, where it's a virtual event. I bring in 10 to 12 experts. It's a rapid fire type event where each expert gives 10 minutes of their best advice. So over 3 or 4 hours, an individual will hear the best advice from 10 or 12 fraud experts. And I've done it once before last year. I'm doing it again this year, and it always gets a great response. So that's the next project that I have that I'm working on.
It sounds very exciting, and it's really impressive what you do for the industry. And after like all this that you've done already, you still continue to try to find a way how to influence people and how to increase their awareness. That's what we discussed a lot during this episode. Hey, Jim, thank you so much for joining me today. It is a great pleasure to speak with you, and I'm really learn as usual. I said each episode, but I'm actually learning a lot today, and yeah, who knows? Maybe it's convinced me to start to look on this ACFE certificate and finally getting this one.
Well, thank you, Ivan. It was my pleasure to be here, and I appreciate you having me for sure.
So I'm going to say my favorite word at the end of each episode, actually, which is cut.